It was Mark Twain that supposedly said, it might be an urban legend, that history doesn't repeat itself, it rhymes. And some of my history today, looking at natural gas in Houston, has some definite rhymes. This is a history that begins with John Henry Kirby, Kirbyville, Kirby Drive, in the period following the Spindletop discovery in 1901, that really changed our area, and it relocated. The oil industry really was relocated from from states such as Pennsylvania, Iowa, down to our area in 1901 following the Spindletop discovery in Beaumont. And Houston was already well developed, and so Houston became, over just a matter of years, the oil capital of the United States and the world. And natural gas joined oil beginning in 1925, and the history of natural gas in Houston can be traced by looking at the history of one company in particular called Houston Natural Gas Corporation. Are any of you old enough to remember Houston Natural Gas? And a lot of times I ask people, were you old enough to see Johnny Carson? And you remember Johnny Carson? Well, Houston Natural Gas was one of the most prominent companies in Houston for many decades, and maybe Humble Oil would be one, but Houston Natural Gas would be second. So we have a history that goes all the way from John Henry Kirby until through the 80s, when Ken Lay joined the old Houston Natural Gas as CEO, and that company became Enron 2 years later. This is my book. I got a very nice endorsement from Joe Pratt, who isn't here today, but he is certainly the instrumental person behind a lot of the Houston history projects and magazine that we enjoy, and he gave me a very nice quotation here. This scholarly work fills in much missing history about two of America's most important industries, electricity and natural gas. Then a slightly different perspective from my mother. She says 5 or 6 pages gets me right to sleep. Mothers, they tell it like it is. So the history here, if you look on the bottom, the Spindletop oil discovery, which led to the formation of a company, Houston Oil Company of Texas. In the 1920s, this company found a lot of natural gas about 100 miles outside of Houston. They decided to pipe it in, and so that was one of the early examples of a thriving natural gas industry here in South Texas. And I'll talk a little bit about the Houston natural gas history here in a second. What's going the wrong way here? Now, John Henry Kirby, he came up with an idea with some investors from St. Louis and a gentleman from New York City named Pat Calhoun to form a mega company. And it was the biggest company in the history of Texas at the time. It was capitalized at $40 million in 1901. That's a lot of money. And this new company, it was going to do two things. It was going to buy a lot of acreage in East Texas. They were going to drill for oil, and they were going to harvest the pine trees and turn timber into lumber. And it was under Texas antitrust law, however, you couldn't have one company do both. So they ended up having two companies. John Henry Kirby, who was an expert in the timber industry, lumber industry, was here in Houston. He would buy sawmills. He would go through the whole operation of turning the pine trees into lumber for the housing market. And in New York City was the oil side of the company, run by a gentleman named Pat Calhoun. And $40 million, it was a big deal. Texas had never seen something like this. And they had a grand party at the Rice Hotel for $10,000. It got started one night about 8, 9 o'clock. It ended up about 3 a.m. the next morning. There were numerous tributes, and this was the first time that the New York Times had ever covered an event in Texas. They actually put a reporter on the train from New York City to come all the way down to Houston to see what in the world was going on. It was a big deal. But they were too busy celebrating. John Henry Kirby needed to buy a lot of sawmills around the state, and when the sawmill owners saw that they're having this grand party, the prices went up a little bit for the sawmills. And Kirby was over budget. He wasn't meeting his stumpage contract. And the other thing was you have really two companies coming out of the same capital source. It's like the two-headed monster. Both of them need capital. They're not communicating well. New York City and Houston are a long ways away. And by 1904, the company, which was highly levered, was in bankruptcy. And firms like Andrews and Kurth made a lot of money off that. John Henry Kirby, the company came out of bankruptcy about 5 years later and had great success. And John Henry Kirby in the early decades of the last century was really Mr. Houston. Everyone would come to him for all sorts of civic activities, political activities, and he was quite a guy. All the things he got involved with, he made a big difference with. And they said, he had $1 million smile, and one banker said, yeah, he smiled me right out of $1 million. He was involved in a lot of things, and we could certainly have a talk just on John Henry Kirby and all the things he did in Houston and for Houston. The Kirby Mansion, Inglenook, amazing. Look, there's indoor ballroom, indoor swimming facilities. This is around the turn of the century. But Houston Oil Company found gas, and they decided to pipe it into Houston. They were going to serve Houston. There was already a company in Houston that was providing coal gas to the residents. So they get to the city limits, and they think they're going to sell to the municipal supplier of Houston called Houston Fuel, and I need to find it out. I should know these things. Once you write them, you don't need to remember it anymore. Houston Gas and Fuel Company. But they didn't execute the contract. They built a 100-mile pipeline, and they didn't have the contracts executed to buy the gas on the other end. And some of the, yes ma'am?
When did they do that?
This is 1925.
When did they start?
I'm sorry?
Was that when they started, or did they start earlier than that?
Houston Oil Company was 1901, right after Spindletop. They found a lot of gas in 1925, about 100 miles outside of Houston. So they built a pipeline to get this natural gas to the Houston city limits. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I was trying to put together the city of Bel Air was laying gas in 19...
Well, okay, this is what, at the time they had coal gas, which was a big advance. Some decade, in the 1890s, they started providing coal gas, and one historian wrote, it was a happy day when Houston's ultra-modern homemakers and homeowners were able to forsake the chore of carrying in wood and coal for cooking and heating, and conversely no longer had to carry out the ashes. So coal gas was first, but then natural gas comes in, which is cheaper and it's a lot cleaner. So they get to the Houston city limits. They think they have a contract with Houston Gas and Fuel Company, but they don't. So what they have to do is to serve the suburbs of Houston. See if you recognize these names. Bel Air, Galena Park, Meadowbrook, Monticello, Pasadena, Rice Court, River Oak, South Houston, Southside Place, and West University Place. Now, they're serving natural gas to these areas, and they're building the small pipes to get it into the houses. And they're serving businesses too, but they want to serve Houston proper. Well, Houston proper was served by the incumbent, Houston Gas and Fuel Company, and they had a franchise from the city. And so the upstart, Houston Natural Gas, wants a second franchise to serve the city. Well, the incumbent company didn't want to give it to them, and the head of the incumbent company, the president, was a gentleman that had a lot of political clout named Captain James A. Baker. Okay? And Captain Baker had a very good relationship with the with the mayor of Houston, Oscar Holcomb. So, Houston Natural Gas, they offer 20% lower rates for Houston, trying to get the second franchise. Houston City Council and the Houston Business Council, no. And Captain Baker was a very persuasive guy. What happened? Well, there was a writer for the Houston Chronicles, sort of the Lauren Steffi of the day, named Mefo, Mefo Foster. And he started writing these articles in the paper. We have the beautiful spectacle of 10 suburbs of Houston getting gas for 20% less. Why not do something to bring to the city the fuel that will add factories and create a lot of benefits? But Mayor Holcomb says no. But then guess what happens? And I'll just read you from the book. Mefo had lit the fire, but the real force for change, that means gas competition in Houston, was led by Houston's housewives, organized as the City Federation of Women's Clubs and the Women's Democratic Club. They held mass meetings and collected signatures for a referendum to award a second franchise to H&G. The homemakers, using gas to cook meals and clean clothes, and in many cases paying the utility bills, overcame the conspicuously silent Houston Chamber of Commerce, whose leaders were not going to cross Captain Baker. Mefo noted the irony: the women turned on the searchlight, the men hid from the public. So, it took about a year, but the blockade of Houston was over. We got gas competition in the city. And there were actually, both companies were building lines across the street from each other. And there were some of the crew members were actually getting into fist fights. And if you had service from one company, you wanted it from the other, what the company needed to do, the second company needed to do, is to get enough people from the residential neighborhood into a bus to get them to City Hall, to have them sign something to say, okay, we can have competition in Houston. So, this was the beginning of Houston Natural Gas, and in some 40, 50 years here, Houston Natural Gas basically had three leaders. It was a very prosperous, stable company. A gentleman named Frank Smith from the mid-30s through the 1950s. Frank Smith Jr. is still around. He's heard this talk. Bus Wimberly, and the Wimberly family still here in Houston, and Robert Herring, who had a great tenure at Houston Natural Gas. That was Frank Smith, and in the lower left is Frank Smith and his successor, Bus Wimberly. Houston Natural Gas was a gas supplier, wholesale and retail, for a lot of South Texas, even outside of Houston. That's how Houston looked in 1946. There's the annual report of Houston Natural Gas. A lot of public service as a public utility. The sign here, invest in your future, attend your church each week. And then, won't you drive safely, what does it say here? Safely too. Without seatbelts, that's a very good thing to do. Now, to increase the demand for natural gas, you need to peddle appliances. At corporate headquarters at the bottom, they have the flame room. They're always showing the latest in gas-using appliances. Here's some other examples of the advertising they had. And you see the advertisement in the upper left where they're really keying on the breadwinner, going, you know, you can really make things better for your wife if you buy those appliances, basically is what they're saying. I can't quite read it. And on the electricity side, one of the most famous advertisements in the history of advertising was this, where they're basically telling the man, buy a few more appliances for your wife. Maybe you shouldn't be going to the bars and spending money on other things. Don't you cherish your wife and her standard of living? And as a matter of fact, your wife will live longer the easier it is for her as a homemaker. Robert Herring was a great leader, Mr. Houston, in the 1970s. He died of cancer in 1981, which began the process where Ken Lay was hired away from Transco. Joanne King married Robert Herring. Robert Herring's first wife died in a pool accident, and they had a wonderful marriage until his death. They were married, I think, about 8 years. And of course, we know her from her very interesting life, and this is her autobiography. A real boom time in Houston during the 70s, but don't, as one businessman said, don't confuse a commodity price boom with genius. And when things changed in the 80s, and I don't have all the, I'm missing a graph here. In the 80s, you know, it's going down that way, and there was a lot of changes. Here's the old Houston Natural Gas building still there. Some different renderings. Here we are in the 1980s when Houston Natural Gas is not doing well. Oscar Wyatt of Coastal comes after Houston Natural Gas, and the Robert Herring successor, Bill Matthews, who was a very good finance man, was not a good CEO. Sometimes they say you can get promoted one time too many, and he was an example of that. And the Houston Natural Gas Board, led by John Duncan, reached out, and they hired sort of the new wonderkind of the natural gas industry, Ken Lay from Transco, who was number 2 to Jack Bowen there. And Ken Lay came over, and this was the beginning of Enron, which is the story of another day. Maybe next year, The Rascal. What's the theme for next year? Well, maybe I can start here next year. Would you have me again? I did go to work for Enron about a year after Ken Lay did. I was part of the mass layoff of December 2001. Houston Chronicle took a picture of me. This was December the 3rd. I was one of 4,000 laid off. Here's a note from Ken Lay. Rob, please take a look at this and see if it makes any sense. And I'm still trying to figure it out. And here I am. I'm your speaker. So that's it. Am I within 20 minutes?